Hi, everybody. First of all, my name is Darakshan. I'm with Justice for Muslims Collective. I'm really excited to be here next to Dr. Maha Hilal, who's also our co-director. We wanted to do sort of a live session to really talk about the recent nominations for the State Department as well as the CIA, and really have been very concerned with how the mainstream narrative around these nominations has really not uplifted the role of institutionalized Islamophobia, the war on terror, the legacies of torture, and the ways that Muslim communities have been impacted. And so we're really excited that we have in-house Maha, who's really been for such a long time, been one of the few Muslims who's really been in this work, in particular in the anti-torture field, really being this Muslim sort of a voice that's there talking about the ways institutionalized Islamophobia plays a role, but also being present and making those linkages of why we have to care about Muslim political prisoners, we have to care about Muslim prisoners, period. We have to close down Guantanamo Bay. We have to make sure we end the policy of torture, that we really hold government institutions accountable for what they have done. So I'm really excited. Maha, I'd love if you could maybe introduce yourself and talk about really the reason that you've been involved for such a long time, and really a space that unfortunately I know for sure I have not seen many Muslims come into. And so if you could just talk about your work around torture, ending torture, Guantanamo Bay. I mean, you've been really one of the few Muslims that's been doing it for like a long time. And so thank you for all of your advocacy efforts. And, you know, I think that now many of us are really coming to realize, unfortunately, why it's important for us to be really fighting to shut down Guantanamo Bay. The principles codified in the law of saying illegal, indefinite detention are absolutely okay, that these are things that are carrying on. And so I'd love if you could just take a few moments to really introduce yourself and the work that you've been doing for people tuning in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Darakshan, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in. So my work on Guantanamo started over 10 years ago, and it started because I had done an internship at Amnesty International in what was then called the Denounce Torture Initiative. And as part of that internship, I was working specifically on closing Guantanamo Bay and ending torture. And for anyone who's observed who exactly is in Guantanamo Bay, it's an exclusively Muslim male population. So for me, as someone who was kind of coming into my political identity and thinking about what it meant to be Muslim in a particular climate post 9/11, this was something that was very devastating to me. And just sort of the realization that the US government could house an offshore illegal prison specifically for Muslims, that we had to create an entirely different system to criminalize Muslims. And this was pretty, depressing for someone who is Muslim, right? And for the work that we're doing and just realizing all of this. So my work on torture and closing Guantanamo started in 2007, but at this point, I've been involved in various efforts around closing Guantanamo, around ending torture. So I'm part of a group called Witness Against Torture, and we went on a delegation to Cuba a couple years ago to draw attention to the prison and to also try to speak with Cuban activists to get sort of more engagement in terms of how we can work together, right? Because a lot of Cubans, as I understood, were interested in the sovereignty aspect, in that the US is occupying the naval base in Guantanamo, and we're interested in obviously closing the prison, so how do we work together? So I'm also involved in Witness Against Torture, and in addition to that, I've been a co-principal investigator with Tulane University's Traumatology Institute. And through that work, I've interviewed specifically torture trauma experts. And the goal of the project is to create a set of handbooks, one for survivors, one for practitioners, and one for survivors' families, to learn more about how they can sort of cope with depression, anxiety, all of the PTSD symptoms that come as a result of torture, and how practitioners can not only do that work and provide guidance for younger practitioners, but who can also think about the particular context in which the torture survivors are coming out of in the context of the war on terror, and then also for survivors' families. So I've really done a lot of work on this front, and one thing that has been noticeably absent throughout is the role that Islamophobia has played in the torture that has been sanctioned by the US government. So it's pretty clear to me, as someone who has been a researcher, advocate, and activist, a lot of these fields, that the Muslim element of all of this is not captured. And I'm not exactly sure why this analysis hasn't been mainstreamed at this point, but when you've seen sort of the pictures that have come out of Guantanamo, if you recall the pictures that came out of Abu Ghraib, it's a type of dehumanization that has been restricted to the Muslim body in the context of the war on terror. So I think it's especially important to be constantly infusing this analysis of Islamophobia into the ways that we think about national security, counterterrorism, and in particular torture, whether it's by the CIA or whether it's in Guantanamo Bay. So these are some of the things that I hope we can talk about tonight.
Mm-hmm. So Maha, I really appreciated one thing I would love if you could maybe perhaps dissect a little bit more is, the narrative around the use of torture, whether it was in like Bagram or in Guantanamo Bay, very much by the government was that here are some bad apples, right? That it was not a matter of policy. So could you maybe perhaps talk about how torture is actually an institutional policy, a tactic, a tool that's been used in the war on terror, and really the institutional complicity that goes back not only to the Bush administration, but also to the Obama administration as well, who, when he was running said, well, he will close down Guantanamo Bay, right? So there have been a lot of empty promises, not just from the Republican end, but also from the Democrats as well. So maybe if you could talk about the use of torture as a policy first, and then maybe link it to the Islamophobia component. I think that would be really helpful for me, and I'm sure also for folks watching.
Right. So torture has been used, of course, in the course of the war on terror for the last 16 years. And it is very much a systemic issue. So when the Abu Ghraib scandal happened, and you can still see the pictures online, unfortunately, it's very brutal torture that's described, right? And in the CIA black sites, you saw things like rectal feeding, prisoners being forced to stand on a broken leg. One prisoner had eye removed, another died of hypothermia. I mean, this is some of the most egregious torture that Muslim prisoners have faced. And when the Abu Ghraib scandal happened specifically, it was also in the context of what we perhaps didn't know then, of a series of memos that had been written specifically sanctioning torture. So John Yoo, who was the author of these memos, redefined the definition of torture such that in order for abuse to rise to the level of torture, it had to result in organ failure or death. Imagine that being the threshold for Muslim prisoners, that you had to rise to the level of organ failure or death. That's pretty egregious. So anything below that was not considered torture. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the fact that it was sort of played off as it's just a few bad apples, and, these few bad apples are prosecuted, and no one higher up who we know sanctioned torture, participated in torture, oversaw torture, multiple roles in facilitating the torture of Muslim bodies, nothing has happened to them. Mm-hmm. And the case of Gina Haspel in particular that we're talking about at this moment indicates that not only does nothing happen to you, you actually get promoted. Right. So torture a Muslim and you will get promoted in your position. You won't be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about that piece a little bit more specifically, because when we talk about accountability, Obama repeatedly said he was going to close Guantanamo, but he also said we need to look forwards and not backwards, right? In other words, what I call it is proactive impunity. Not only was he forgiving the torture that happened before him, he was also creating a way for him to be forgiven for any torture that happened under him. And so long as the system continues in which people are not actually held accountable for torture, nothing is going to change. And Gina Haspel's nomination is presumably going to come about in the next month or so. And while the Democrats are going to probably feel heroic in asking critical questions about Haspel's role in the torture apparatus of the war on terror, it may still very well result in her being nominated, because this country is not serious about addressing torture.
I mean, Maha, can you maybe also talk a little bit about the institutions involved in sort of carrying out torture, right? So there is definitely, we've seen the proliferation of sort of what you call Guantanamo North communication management units right here domestically. We've seen Guantanamo Bay, we've seen black sites, we've also seen sort of the U.S. training other nations and other states as well to carry out in complicity torture. So maybe could you talk about the institutional piece behind this as well? I think that would be helpful, as well as the complicity of people like psychologists as well who were part of it. I mean, you know, people who went and really participated, medical professionals who participated in this. So maybe if you could talk about that as well, the institutions behind it who are definitely complicit in upholding this.
Right. I mean, I think in the current context, right, we would draw most closely from the CIA, who ran and continues to run black sites where some of the most egregious tortures happened, and where we had the Senate Intelligence Committee report come out specifically on the ways in which the CIA tortured Muslims in their custody. I could go on and on about the types of torture that were used. It's very brutal, it's very egregious, and it shows how much the state has dehumanized Muslims such that this kind of torture is not only sanctioned, but there isn't an outrage when we find out, right? It's just another Muslims are being tortured. So there's a very, again, like a systemic nature to all of this. And of course, there's still Guantanamo Bay. You know, under Obama, he theoretically made torture illegal, but that didn't actually stop the torture from happening. And again, this relates back to institutional accountability. There is no accountability, and as long, again, as there's no accountability, nothing is going to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, Maha, I really appreciate the piece you mentioned about accountability, because I remember, again, when Obama took office, you know, one of the first things he did is he sort of gave immunity to higher ups in the CIA and Department of Justice who should have been held accountable around the issue of torture. And I remember at that point, the narrative that was being said is we must look forward and not look backward. And yet here we are, where the person being nominated for the head of the CIA has actually ran a black site. We're also seeing with the State Department nomination what kind of sort of a spectrum or the kind of sort of framework that this administration really sees world engagement with, right? And so I'd love if you could maybe talk a little bit about what does then accountability around torture look like at sort of the community level, at the institutional level, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about also what, you know, as Muslim communities, right? I mean, as someone who's had someone in my family tortured, I know that one of the things, and then labeled, right, this terrorist, that there's a lot of shame in coming forward in the Muslim community and saying it because the fear that exists around really anybody labeled a terrorist. And so there's a lot of sort of community outcasting, community not really being there. Could you talk about the role of like the Muslim community in particular, and where solidarity efforts could internally be happening before we talk about sort of solidarity from, you know, other communities towards us?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question first. And, you know, I can say in all my years of experience, which is over 10 now, in working on closing Guantanamo and ending torture, I've been one of a handful of Muslims. So I, of course, attend the protest every January 11th to commemorate yet another year of the prison being opened. And I'm often there with 2 or 3 other Muslims. So it's not really something that has resonated, at least with the Muslim American community. There's many theories that we can probably put forward as to why that might be happening. But I think, to me, one thing that I've compared it to in the recent context is the ways in which the Muslim community mobilized around the Muslim ban, and to see that there was this huge difference in the numbers that came and really mobilized around the Muslim ban, but yet have been virtually silent when it comes to Guantanamo Bay. And the difference to me in that is really around how the victims of both have been socially constructed. So Guantanamo is a group of people who've been constructed as terrorists, right? These are the men that are the worst of the worst, right? And I think in a lot of ways, the Muslim community has come to internalize that, or at least has been too afraid to challenge that narrative. And I think that that's been really problematic. And when you look at how the Muslim ban has been, the victims of the Muslim ban have been constructed, it's largely this group of innocent Muslims who are denied entry for no conceivable reason other than the fact that they're Muslim. So there's a huge difference. And when I think about the ways and, the role that my Guantanamo advocacy plays into, for example, the Muslim ban, the connection I make specifically is that when we do advocacy and we sort of address the ways that Guantanamo Bay prisoners have been criminalized specifically, it will have ripple effects in terms of how all other Muslims are constructed, right? Because these are the most criminalized. And to me, when we're only starting out with the Muslim ban, we're kind of starting in the middle, right? This is a sort of easier social construction to work with, to think about dismantling. And what we really need to dismantle is the idea that is very much a part of Guantanamo, that Muslims are inherently terrorists. There have been numerous people there that have had no charges whatsoever brought against them. And why are they there? It's because they are Muslim. And that's the source of why they were captured in the first place. Now, in terms of the shame of torture, I mean, that's a huge question. And, you know, you can read, there's numerous articles. You can go to the Traumatology Institute's website, where I've done a number of interviews with torture trauma practitioners, and it's really something that survivors struggle with. And, you know, in the future, we could perhaps bring a survivor of torture on to kind of tell us a little bit more about their experience. But the ways in which they're dehumanized in the torture surrounding. Imagine being shoved into a coffin. Imagine being sleep deprived. Imagine having to wake up with music blasting in your ears. Imagine having your body hung from a rope where you felt like your body was being stretched. I mean, these are the most egregious kinds of torture. And not only is it it's pain, it's injury inflicted on your body, right? It also damages your psychology, your psyche. And I would encourage you all to read an article from the New York Times that was published in October of 2016. And it was about basically the legacy of these damaged minds. So what happens to these prisoners once they're released, right? Their lives don't return to normal. It's impossible, practically impossible for their lives to return to normal. And they suffer from depression, from anxiety, from PTSD. There are numerous ways that survivors of torture suffer. And there's a lot of literature that documents exactly how extensive the suffering is. And, you know, one of the most devastating things for them, I think, is that, you know, you lose your ability to trust other human beings, right? And when you lose that ability, it's very hard to have a normal life. And when it comes, sorry, one more thing, because I have a lot to say on this. And when it comes to, you know, prisoners from Guantanamo, for example, who many of whom have been sent to third-party countries, they not only are sent to places where they don't know the language or not familiar with the culture, but also have no contact with their families. So they already have the burdens of, you know, dealing with their mental and physical health, in addition to the fact that they can't reunite with their family and can't resume these relationships that probably preserved a lot of their sanity in their lives generally. And then in terms of what does accountability look like, you know, I think that definitely this, you know, the U.S. government needs to adopt a policy of prosecuting anyone who orders overseas, participates in torture. I don't think that's ever going to happen. And one of the reasons why I also don't think it's going to happen, not just because of sort of the legacy of a lack of accountability, but also because of this perpetual narrative that this is not who we are, right? This idea that this is somehow what happened post 9/11 is an aberration of our policies pre 9/11. That's categorically untrue. There's numerous books. You can read a scholar named Alfred McCoy's books who documents the history of torture within the U.S. context decades before 9/11. So long as we keep up with this idea, again, this narrative that this is not who we are, it's going to be, again, increasingly hard to prosecute torturers. And it's treated like it's a mistake, right? That's all it was. It's not just a mistake. It's a type of abuse, torture that destroyed lives.
Absolutely. Maha, before I have questions, I actually have somebody here who asked a question earlier on that I think is important about, you know, they asked, it's Karima, they asked, how can Muslims make other left-leaning people realize that Islamophobia needs to be organized against as much as sort of racism, homophobia, patriarchy, misogyny, and so forth? And I know that that is something we've talked a lot about, in particular about progressive leftist spaces too, where we see sort of liberal Islamophobia happening. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about particularly Karima's question, and then I definitely see some more as well. And please do ask your questions. I'm definitely reading it. This is meant to be engaging for all of us. So.
So, you know, that's a question that I struggle with, because I can tell you I've been reading numerous articles in terms of the Gina Haspel's nomination to the CIA, and I have yet to see a single one, and believe me, I've read many, that mention the fact that these victims were Muslim. You might be able to deduce it from the names Abu Zubaydah and al-Nashiri, But beyond that, there's no mention specifically of the fact that this torture program was designed to inflict abuse on Muslims. And so what I've been doing in my personal and professional capacity is to kind of push this analysis. So on email threads I've been part of, I encourage people to center the Muslims who have been victims. I encourage people to think about the ways in which Islamophobia allowed for the sanctioning of this type of abuse and torture. I'm not sure that it's not quite as mainstreamed as we would like it to be. I think there's more of an opportunity now, unfortunately, because of the way that Trump's presidency has been so explicitly anti-Muslim. So I think people are increasingly being able to see that more. But nonetheless, it is still very surprising and disturbing at this point that 16 years after the war on terror, we still have to explain to people that the primary victims have been Muslim. And in particular around torture, that has been something designed specifically for Muslims.
Wow. Thank you, Maha, for saying that. One of the things that I've also been just thinking about a lot is that some of the polls that come out around, unfortunately, that there is actually a lot of support for torture policy. So, there's the government, the institutions, this administration, previous administrations, but unfortunately, there's also public support for the use of torture. I know I found it very difficult being in certain conversations where people say, well, yeah, torture works. And, this way that really Muslims and anybody racialized as Muslim in the war on terror is just depicted as collateral damage. So it doesn't even matter necessarily if you're innocent or you're guilt. The idea is always that to get the one terrorist out there, it's okay to kill millions and torture millions, and even so what, right? So could you talk about, we're literally now, since the war on terror, like 16 plus years out, and yet there still seems to be public support for these kind of policies. And I'd say, like, for me, just speaking about myself as a Muslim, I know I get really scared about the fear of another terrorist attack happening or something else happening that's an act of mass violence where it's a Muslim behind it, because all of a sudden, I remember where Trump was like, you know what, let's just open up Guantanamo Bay and send even U.S. citizens there, right? Not that I want to make this binary of that U.S. Muslim citizens deserve more rights. I don't think that. I think everybody deserves sort of basic sort of rights, but really that there is this public sort of support for torture.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And, one thing I have wanted to do is sort of measure the levels of support for torture from 2000 till the present and see where it sort of ebbed and flowed and what kind of policy or legal changes accounted for that. But one very disturbing poll that was done by the ABC and Washington Post in response to the CIA torture report that came out in 2014. And the question that was asked was something along the lines of whether or not people thought the torture that was used was legitimate, or justified, I should say. It was whether or not it was justified. I believe about 49% of those polled said it was justified. Imagine knowing what I've said about the type of torture that was used by the CIA and having a response of 49% of the people saying it was justified. Not only is that a problem in terms of the actual number, but also in terms of the language, right? We're talking not about whether it's humane, whether it's legal, whether it's moral. We're talking about whether it's justified. So can the damaging and destruction of Muslim lives be justification for continuing illegal practices? And that's a problem. And so, one of the larger structures that we need to address in all of this is the narrative, right? And the role that the narrative plays in shaping the dehumanization of Muslims that then sanctions this kind of abuse.
No, that's really, so I have a question here that I actually definitely think is a good one, and it's, I believe, from Patrice. I'm sorry if I messed up your name, but they say that thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you so much for tuning in. We always love shout outs to JMC, by the way. So they said, would you say it is most important to continue fighting the Muslim ban or focus our efforts elsewhere? It feels like every day is a new challenge. Hell yeah. So I want to put my effort into what helps most. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what do you say to that? I think that's a really thing that I think a lot of advocates struggle for, because we are under capacity, we have limited resources, and yet we have these onslaught of just these systems of criminalization that are hitting us. So what would you say to that about the Muslim ban versus other efforts? I
mean, I think it's generally speaking important for people to be involved in a large a variety of various issues, right? I think it's important for people to mobilize around the Muslim ban. It's important for people to mobilize around Guantanamo and anti-torture work. But I think what's the most important is not just what issue you plug into, but how you talk about the issue. So to me, the most important piece of this is to link these various laws and policies to their systemic nature, so that when you're talking about the Muslim ban, you connect it to the torture, you connect it to Guantanamo Bay, you connect it to the communication management units domestically. It's all about this connection, because when you're then just advocating for that one specific issue, if you're putting it into a context, then people can understand how one thing relates to the other and broaden their analysis around Islamophobia, which I think is the most important thing that we need to do now.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And I think that one of my concerns that I share with Maha is that, if we don't make those connections, that the Muslim ban is part and parcel of these larger sort of anti-Muslim policies, anti-refugee policies, that if we're just focused on one thing, then we're not really winning, right? Short-term sort of wins, but not actually challenging the system overall, the structure overall, does not leave our communities better. What it just does is it just gives more time for then another administration to come in and even get sort of more explicit violent policies, right? I'm also going to ask a question that Ramon, thank you so much for tuning in, by the way. So he asks, does the culture of militarization contribute to the mindset of supporting torture?
Absolutely, and thank you, Ramon, for asking that question. I mean, militarism is a huge part, right? And we often think of militarism in the context of wars abroad, where we don't see this collateral damage. But we very much know that, hold on one second.
1 second, clearly early.
Oh, great. Okay, so we very much know that militarism is a huge part of it. And when I think about the ways in which, for example, the U.S. wars abroad relate to what's happening domestically and at Guantanamo, it's, again, another way of dehumanizing Muslim bodies. I mean, there's no way that over 1 million Muslims could be killed in wars abroad and that not have ramifications for the domestic context. So I think that's really important. And I think generally when it comes to militarism, it's, that's the only policy we adopt, right? That's the only way we attempt to theoretically solve our national security problems, right? Mm-hmm. There's no diplomacy. Mm-hmm. There's no, for example, in the context of suspected terrorists, treating them in a criminal system, right? A federal mm-hmm. criminal justice system that could very well handle these cases. It's always about military force and military might, because that's the only way that we can perceive of the United States as a country that's strong, because our strength is measured in terms of how strong our military is, not in terms of how strong we pursue justice.
So, Maha, that's a really good point that you mentioned, and I'm happy that you brought in particularly the criminal justice system, right? I'd love to see if you could make some connections between sort of us being a prison nation, this problem of mass incarceration. I mean, I know that, for example, you look at Rikers Island, you look at jails, the practice of solitary confinement that is now being called torture, the ways that people are stripped of their humanity and sort of given numbers and called detainees in jails here, which again, Black and brown bodies tend to be the ones that are incarcerated. Could you maybe make some linkages also to sort of the issue of mass incarceration domestically, and how Guantanamo and sort of this sort of prison nation buildup also abroad, how they also connect together?
Yeah, let's start with the first point, which is that it's ironic that it's called a justice system, right? Because for anyone who's Black and brown, the last thing that they could probably expect is to get justice in these systems. Guantanamo and its derivatives, the CIA black sites or vice versa, are very much a symptom of the U.S. being a mass incarceration state, right? It's just a continuation of that. In the cases of the black sites and Guantanamo, the message there, the symbolic message there is your crimes are so bad and your identity is such that you are so authorized that we need to have, again, this entirely separate system of justice for you. Not real justice, obviously, but the sort of the idea of justice. And, when it comes to mass incarceration domestically and sort of the activism around that, I think one of the issues that I've always been perplexed about is why Muslim criminality in the context of the war on terror hasn't been more thoroughly included into the work that's being done. And I think, again, we can draw back from this idea of social constructions in that this crime of terrorism has been constructed in such a way so as to sort of make it as though it's the most egregious crime one could commit, right? And again, that this crime is specifically attached to Muslims. So there's been sort of this mainstream mass incarceration movement that hasn't been inclusive of Muslims. And that's not to say that the burden lies on those doing the work. Obviously, they're doing a lot of work, but it's on, for those of us who are Muslim and who understand the way the U.S. functions when it comes to criminal justice, is to really start to see this entire apparatus for what it is. And I think the communication management units, although they don't have a large population of Muslims, when they were initially opened and created in 2006 and 2008, respectively, their entire populations were 100% Muslim. And the only reason they're not 100% Muslim now is because the government wanted to distract people from the allegation that these prisons were entirely Muslim. So I think there's a couple of things here. One is that we need to figure out how to mainstream the detention of Muslims into the mass incarceration movement, and also to deconstruct this idea of what the crime of terrorism is.
That's a good one. Definitely. I remember once when I was sort of at an event that was talking about ending mass incarceration. And again, a lot of love for people in that work. It's hard work, definitely needed. But I remember someone just being like, well, these are not actually the ones that are flying planes into buildings and being terrorists. They're actually the ones so there was this sort of like good, bad, criminal dichotomy that was created that is absolutely throws many of our folks under the bus. And at the same time, I also think that our communities can also do more for sort of Muslims who are incarcerated in the domestic sphere as well. So I think overall, we just have a lot of work to do internally in our communities. I think going back, Maha, could you talk a little bit about the sort of the human cost of torture on the individuals who've been incarcerated? You talked a little bit about that. I mean, the punishment does not just end for those, some people have died, have been murdered, who've been detained, and, again, no justice around that. But also people, once they leave, because the punishment doesn't end there, right? We see that even here with people who've been incarcerated and are returning into communities are punished heavily. I mean, it's a continuous sort of punishment. It strips you of your rights. Can you talk a little bit about that as well, about this labeling and shaming of you, even post if you're to get out, right?
Yeah. And so I want to start by saying that, a lot of the work in the human rights movement is aimed at, for example, closing Guantanamo Bay or closing the CIA black sites. Where the work sort of leaves off is what happens after these people are released, right? So how do they resume some semblance of normalcy in their life, to the extent to which that's even possible? And again, there are numerous mental health consequences of torture. There's a book called The Mental Health Consequences of Torture that you can read. There's extensive literature. There are the interviews that I mentioned earlier. And with those interviews in particular, what I wanted to get at is not only the mental health consequences that we know have been documented from a large range of studies and articles and things like that, but also the role of this, in the case of Muslim prisoners, the perpetual rise and fear around Muslims. So it's not only that you're a Muslim prisoner who's been released and sent to a third-party country where you have no connections, but you're also dealing with the daily weight of Islamophobia. That doesn't go away. So you have to heal, or find ways to heal, or try to heal, in the context of this continuous dehumanization, this narrative that is unabating, right? That continues to haunt these people. And, I can only imagine how difficult that must be, right? To try to resume your life in the context of having been criminalized by this system of oppression that then follows you post-release and post-torture. And I think that that's something that definitely deserves a lot more attention. And my heart goes out to people all the torture survivors who have had to deal with this. And the last thing I'll say is, this is kind of an old report, but there was a report called Guantanamo and its Aftermath, and I think it was from 2008, where some researchers from Berkeley interviewed 66 Guantanamo Bay prisoners that had been released. And it really documents the extensive consequences of torture on their lives.
A lot of heavy stuff. A lot of it. And also, wow, you know so much. It's incredible, mashallah, for your brilliance, for all of this. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, particularly around torture and sort of the imagery that we also saw, for example, of the dead bodies, that came out of Bagram, out of Guantanamo Bay, is what is the sort of impact on the larger Muslim community? Because I see this as very much on their own, right? This imagery of, look, this is what we will do to you Muslims, right? And like the way it becomes sort of a tactic of the state to make you more afraid, to also want to say, I don't even want to touch anything on torture or Guantanamo Bay or the war on terror, because we're already under suspicion, right? Just to be Muslim is to be under suspicion, and to be more Muslim in your identity, whether spiritual, religious, political, all of them merging together, is almost like putting yourself even out there. And then to center the state's repression against you, there's very legitimate sort of fears and concerns. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit, break down for me the sort of psychological impact on Muslims when we're seeing this imagery, when we're seeing this happening. What does that look like?
You know, so I'll speak for myself. You know, when I see the very dehumanizing pictures that have come out of Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, you know, I see myself in these prisoners, right? In the sense that this could happen to any Muslim. And Guantanamo Bay prison in particular sort of occupies that threat, right? When President Trump continues to say that he wants, he signed an executive order reversing Obama's order to close the prison. When he says he wants to keep it open, when he says he wants more Muslims to be sent there, we know that it's not just, you know, a fear, right? It's a threat, right? And it could very well happen, right? I don't think that there may be more political will for more prisoners not being sent to Guantanamo in this at this point, but I don't think that there's necessarily an overwhelming amount of political will to absolutely stop that from happening. So I think it is very damaging to the Muslim psyche. I haven't done any empirical studies specifically on the ways that Muslims internalize these various images that they see, but I think it's very damaging, right? You're seeing people who are part of your community be dehumanized in a very particular way. And I think that's, you know, extremely depressing. And, you know, I think when we're talking about how to sort of dismantle some of this thinking, one of the ways I think is most important is this idea of counter-narrative, right? And to create our own counter-narratives. So most of the time, when the Muslim community responds in what they would refer to as a counter-narrative, it's simply a negation of the dominant narrative that we're not terrorists. We don't actually have to adhere to that script, right? We don't actually have to respond to the idea that Muslims are inherently terrorists. We can create our own narrative, and that's what we should be doing, right? Because we have to deconstruct these problematic images of Muslims that have allowed, it's a cycle, right? So you dehumanize Muslims, and then people see them as dehumanized, and that serves to legitimize more brutality towards them. So we have to break out of this narrative around what Muslims are and who they are and what types of crimes they commit in order to sort of dismantle the entire system. And I think, again, I want to be very critical in interrogating this idea of a counter-narrative and what it means to actually create one that will empower your community, not simply respond to and acquiesce to the dominant narrative.
So I think connected to the narrative component of that, and I would love if we could talk specifically to, again, not all necessarily Muslim advocacy efforts, right? Because there's good work out there, absolutely. We know folks in the trenches who've been pushing and do amazing work, and that sort of like resistance work exists in our communities. But I know for me personally, when I saw the nomination of Haspel in particular, the thing that was making me so upset was that, you know, there has been money poured into a countering Islamophobia strategy. There have been resources put into sort of tackling this issue. And a lot of it really, to me, felt like, what was the point of all of that if we are now sitting under a Trump administration after an Obama administration where we're literally seeing people explicitly rewarded for being some of the worst bigoted, anti-Muslim, xenophobes, Islamophobes, you can racist, you know, all of that out there. And so, you know, can we have a real honest reflection of what has the strategy of our work for our communities been? And again, I think from what I've seen, again, in my sort of opinion, and my perspective in watching this work, is that there's been a real specific decentering of direct victims of the war on terror, whether it's on a domestic front or on a global front. And I would say even kind of push to say that American Muslim issues are not necessarily connected all to the global Muslim community, even though the source of the sort of the entity or the institutions that are at the helm of the war on terror are U.S. institutions, basically. And so I'd love if maybe we can talk a little bit about, what are the strategies, the advocacy efforts that we've been having? How can we do better by really our community at the end of the day?
I mean, I think it just comes back to mainstreaming this analysis around institutionalized Islamophobia. And I think we have a particularly good moment here. Unfortunately, we're under a very aggressively anti-Muslim administration. However, it has opened many people's eyes to the fact that for the last 16 years, there has been a policy of discriminating and targeting, detaining, torturing Muslims, etc. So I think we have a particular opportunity now to really think about how are we going to challenge that. And again, one of the ways is to center this analysis around institutionalized Islamophobia. That absolutely has to be part of any analysis. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. When we talk about the wars abroad, the fact again that over 1 million Muslims can be killed, and to think that people have no outrage or compassion for that, how do you think that that bleeds into the domestic context, the ways that people see Muslims? And, for better or worse, people see us as connected, especially the diaspora communities. Obviously, there's, the Black indigenous Muslim community as well that, suffers in a distinctly different way. But for some of us in the diaspora community, where people see us as an extension of the people abroad. So I think that we really have to, mainstream that. I'm not sure if I wanted to say anything else, but I do think your question and comment around decentering Muslims is particularly important. And, I don't know why Muslims have been decentered to a large extent, except for other people wanting to center themselves. And I think if you're really intentional and theoretically wanting to uplift impacted communities, everything that has happened in the war on terror has been targeting Muslims and people racialized as Muslims. So if you're not willing to incorporate that analysis, then in my mind, you're not actually serious about dismantling Islamophobia.
Wow, absolutely. Definitely, no. Is there anything else, Maha, that you want to add on or make a point?
So Pam, I think, had asked a question earlier. I'm just trying to read it quick.
I don't know if you see Pam here.
So thank you so much, Pam. So Pam's question was around non-Muslims acting with intention and centering Muslim voices and things like the recent CIA nomination and, just being aware of the dynamics that exist in the national security kind of culture. And I think that that's a great question. And thank you so much, Pam, for asking. I think it's a lot about providing platforms and opportunities for Muslims to speak, right? So if you run like a news paper online or like a magazine online or some platform, get Muslims to talk about the ways that they're perceiving these national security issues. Get Muslims to testify at congressional hearings, right? There are many Muslims who would be glad to share their experiences, their perceptions, the work that they've done around Islamophobia. And I think that there's just a very intentional way you can do that, right? I went to a hearing a couple of weeks ago on the authorization for the use of military force, and Islamophobia was not mentioned a single time. Okay, the authorization for the use of military force has essentially allowed the US government to bomb many countries, right? Not just supposedly anyone involved in the 9/11 attacks, but onto other iterations of terrorist groups that the US helped create. And it seems it's very unending, right? So the fact that we still don't have this analysis is very perplexing to me. So I think to the extent to which we have allies and non-Muslims working in these spaces to really help, do signal boosting to uplift Muslim narratives, in particular the narratives of victims directly, right? At this point, there are multiple Guantanamo Bay prisoners, for example, that have not only spoken about their story, but are still willing to speak about their story. So finding a way to incorporate their experiences, their perspectives into all of these things.
And then Maha, I think a follow-up question to that would be, we definitely have these nominations coming up. What are some ways for folks who are actually joining us to get plugged into some of the advocacy work and to really, I think, use this opportunity whether she actually gets nominated and becomes the head of the CIA, which is very, very likely. But I think it's an opportunity for us to really use the moment to, number one, disrupt the narrative, the dominant discourse, which has absolutely decentered the issue of institutionalized Islamophobia, the legacy of torture. And so are there maybe some like 2 to 3 steps or some things that you would tell folks, particularly joining us now, who can get involved, right? Take some active action steps, because political education is sort of step one. How can we mobilize folks, right? So if you have some ideas around that, because you've been leading, again, a lot of the efforts around this work. So
I think that's a great question. And, you know, as part of the Justice for Muslims collective work, one thing that we are going to be doing is mobilizing around the nomination hearings. And we're likely going to do some sort of rally or protest outside of wherever this nomination hearing happens, and to really draw attention to not just the use of torture, which we all know, but the use of torture against Muslim victims. And that has to be central to that. So if you're in DC, we definitely want you to come out and attend the demonstration or action, whatever it is that we do. There's also various groups like Defending Rights and Dissent that are doing a lot of good work on the sort of congressional level that we haven't yet had the capacity to do. So, you know, going to lobby visits with your congressional members, signing on to statements, figuring out a way to get questions for the nomination hearings in the hands of congressional members, working with organizations that do that kind of work. And certainly for Justice for Muslims Collective, we'll be uplifting all of this work around this CIA nomination, because it's something that absolutely needs to be stopped. At the same time, you know, while we have attention focused on this particular individual who oversaw torture, we have to also broaden the perspective to think about the CIA as an institution. And I know that this is not necessarily something unique that I'm saying now, but I think once the discussion dies down, either she's nominated or not, we still need to then refocus our attention on the CIA as an institution that has continued to abuse human rights, not just you know, in the Middle East, not just at the CIA black sites, in Latin America, in Africa. I mean, there's so many places where this is happening. So it's not just important, again, to focus on her nomination, but again, the systemic issues that the CIA has long perpetuated.
And Maha, I think connected to that, can you just name some of the other institutions too that I feel like are just trampling on all of our communities at the domestic level and also the global level, that again, it's not necessarily about the individual. Of course, individuals are important in rallying people and galvanizing, but that even if you remove Haspel, or even if you tried to get a light torturer in there, someone who's liberal, that we would still have an issue, because the institution is built on actually oppressing our folks. So maybe you could talk about the CIA. There's also other institutions.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, obviously the FBI is one of the purveyors of great violence against Black and Brown communities, particularly the Black Muslim community, with the recent designation of Black identity extremists. And so that's another institution that has to be combated. And they're all working towards the same goal, right, which is to continue the criminalization of Black and brown bodies for the purpose of preserving their jobs, right? Their job is to criminalize our communities so they can go to work every day. So, I mean, obviously we need to target the FBI. The FBI is also, you know, behind the countering violent extremism programs, which are becoming increasingly insidious and incorporated into a wide range of programs that many of which seem benign. So obviously that, and, you know, the Department of Justice, obviously with, in the case of the torture, right, they are not unclassifying the entire torture report. So they are, you know, intentionally holding on to information about the torture that occurred when we already know torture has occurred. And we already know that there likely won't be any accountability whatsoever, but this is a failure for that institution to be transparent. So there are a number of agencies and institutions, but fundamentally, I mean, I think we have to challenge American exceptionalism, American hegemony as part of the ways in which we think about these institutions and the way they operate, again, to criminalize various communities.
Awesome. Any last thoughts, Maha, that you want to share with folks that have joined? Thank you, by the way, everybody. I also want to throw a Department of Homeland Security in there too, by the way.
Thank you.
DHS, you're not off the hook either. And so, but if there's anything sort of last, I mean, you know, again, this work is going to continue. And I think one of the things that's really important for us is to really because there's a lot of sort of that erasure of the violence that has already occurred. And so once we get sort of mainstreaming of some of this, people get so shocked, and they're like, oh, it's happening, as if it just started happening today. But we know this violence has been around for a very long time. So unfortunately, the painful memorializing, remembering when these things happen, the history of it, the impunity, how they build off of each other, so critical for us remembering that there's a long history of this, unfortunately. So is there any last things that you want to say to the amazing folks that joined in our incredible community?
I would just say if any of you are working on writing around this recent nomination, or are on radio shows or whatever other media platforms, to really center the Muslim victims. I think that is definitely an ask that I would like to make. And also, if you're interested in getting more involved in closing Guantanamo, ending torture, I'd very much be happy to speak with you and see how we can involve you in all of these efforts. And I especially say this for Muslims who have long shied away from doing this kind of work, which I think is really important at this moment.
Absolutely. And just one more plug for Justice for Muslims Collective. If you're not on our listserv, definitely please join our listserv so we can continuously keep you in the loop. Maha and I will also be doing some of these more live sessions just to sort of give you alternative analysis to what we're just not seeing. So definitely do tune in. We definitely want to use our space to sort of share our knowledge and our work and our experience. And so again, lots of love to my beautiful friend here who's just a genius. And really, I mean, I admire you so much. I saw you as, again, really one of the few Muslims who was like fighting against torture and Muslim prisoners, and I know it really inspired me, because it takes a lot of courage to be a Muslim, to say that despite the state's designation of you being a terrorist and you then being sort of you being legitimized as being treated totally with so much punishment, I think it takes a level of just humanity to actually see people. So I just want to thank you for all the work that you've been doing, and I'm sure many people joining in admire you along with me. So anyways, and love you all as well.
Thank you.
Bye.